The moment has arrived. I'm Tom Dickinson, and this is a podcast called Doctor Who, The Moment. On each episode, I invite a guest who is a fan of the television show Doctor Who to talk to me about a moment from an episode of Doctor Who. For this week's episode, I spoke with Kyle Anderson, senior editor for Nerdist.com and co-host of the Writers' Room podcast. Kyle and I spoke way back in January of 2022, so yes, this is one of those vintage barrel-aged episodes you've been hearing so much about. Kyle wanted to chat about a moment from Inferno, the 7-part final story in the 1970 season of Doctor Who, Jon Pertwee's first season, starring as the Third Doctor. That season saw the Doctor stranded on Earth with his TARDIS out of order. In Inferno, as part of his collaboration with UNIT, the Doctor investigates a drilling project led by Professor Stallman, which seeks to penetrate the Earth's crust and access a powerful energy source that is thought to lie beneath it. The Doctor has been urging caution while becoming increasingly frustrated with both the drilling project and his own UNIT colleagues, leading him to make a somewhat ill-advised attempt to ditch UNIT at last with the console of his still malfunctioning TARDIS. Things do not go as he had hoped, and the Doctor and his busted console wind up in a nightmarish parallel universe where Britain has become a totalitarian dictatorship. The Doctor finds himself surrounded by fascist versions of UNIT and of the same drilling project, which has progressed even more dangerously close to disaster. As parts 3 and 4 of this 7-part serial proceed, the Doctor has tried with increasing desperation to get through to the fascist doppelgangers of his UNIT comrades, who think him a spy or a saboteur. As episode 4 concludes, he's managed to escape his captors, disguise himself in a hazmat suit, and sneak into the drilling facility with the goal of sabotaging the drill to avert disaster at the last moment. But the brigade leader, the one-eyed, clean-shaven fascist counterpart of UNIT's brigadier, notices that something is up, and that is when Kyle's moment happens.
0 minus 1 minute 20 seconds. Non-technical staff to safety positions.
They're getting closer and closer to breaching the surface, and the Doctor runs in disguise into the control room to try to stop it.
1 minute 10 seconds. All systems checked for final countdown.
And so he spent the entirety of episode 4 trying to explain to everybody.
0 minus 1 minute 0 seconds and counting. Final countdown commences now.
Come down here.
No, this is a bad thing. You must stop the drill.
0 minus 50 seconds. Stand by.
Hear what I said? Come down here.
And they just think he's a spy or an environmentalist or something like that. He's found out.
0 minus 40 seconds.
You must stop this countdown before it's too late.
Stand by.
Do you hear me? You must stop it.
Gatekeeper, shoot that man now. You can't do that. It's just murder.
If you break through the Earth's crust now, you'll release forces you never dreamed could exist.
And then he just says, with all of his doctorly gusto,
Listen to that.
0
That's the sound of
minus
this
20
panic
seconds.
screaming out its rage.
Countdown will now proceed by
and
second.
it is.
Go on, run for it, run.
And then at that point, it's high-pitched and squealing, and there's people with guns, and the editing is really fast, and there's no music. And then Dr. Stallman, the evil bad guy, picks up a gun and points it at him, and that's the way the episode ends.
2, 1.
To me, it is exactly the Third Doctor in a nutshell, and then also the Doctor as a whole. He has no way to get through to these people. They think he's lying 100% of the time. And so he says something that sounds kind of like, what could this possibly mean? The sound of this planet screaming out its rage. But at that point, there is nothing else to describe the kind of evil ancient horror that is awaiting them just by drilling into the surface. It's one of the most economical uses of sound and vision and everything like that. But then the line itself adds so much horror to it that it just it gave me chills just watching it in preparation for this. The filmmaking aspect of that entire scene is so great. At that point, I believe Barry Letts had taken over from Douglas Camfield, who was ill, to shoot all of the interiors. And it's just so well edited. It's got a cinematic quality that not a lot of in-studio shot on video parts of Doctor Who ever did. It could be the climax of the entire thing, even though there's still 3 episodes afterwards.
So you're a bit of a horror fan, aren't you?
I am.
So I'm curious about what you think about Doctor Who's approach to horror and how this sits within that. Because like you say, this is an instance of horror. I don't know if it's intended to terrify the viewer. I don't know, maybe it is. I don't know.
It's a tough one because, I mean, Doctor Who has always been kind of talked about as a scary show in some way, you know, hiding behind the sofa, which I don't know about you. Our sofa was against the wall. It was impossible to hide behind. But the idea of like, oh, it's scary, but scary to a point and stuff like that. And they're always riding the line, especially in the 70s, of like, how scary can we get without going too far? And so I think it depends on what kind of horror they're trying to do. They've done gothic horror pastiches in the past.
Where are we? A priest
They work to varying degrees.
The Victorian Gothic folly. Nonsense.
So pedantic at a time like this.
But the problem is that it always has to be kind of science fictional. What I think really works about the one in Inferno and this moment is that it's kind of like cosmically horrifying, and also like primordially horrifying and stuff, where you don't have to actually see anything. It's conceptually horrifying. We do see people slowly start to mutate, and then in episode 5 is when we start seeing people actually in like full-on werewolfy makeup and stuff. So we know that there is something evil that is leeching out and transforming people and like making people do things that they maybe wouldn't normally do and things like that, which is itself quite terrifying. But I think Doctor Who...
The Fendal absorbs the full spectrum of energy, what some people call a life force or the soul.
The image of the Fendal does this.
It eats life itself.
That must be what the old woman saw.
There's a few in the new series too.
When was this?
The Satan Pit actually
Before time.
does this fairly well.
What does that mean?
Before time.
The idea is
What
that
does before time mean?
it is something
Before time and light and space and matter.
beyond time. Like the Doctor has no kind of scientific sense for what it is. And so he has to talk about it in these grand kind of ethereal terms, because that's the scariest thing to the Doctor, is stuff that they can't explain and they can't work out through science. It's not, oh, it's a vampire, it's like a blood disease or like a fish monster using a cloak or whatever like that. This is just like, it's evil. It's literally the rage of this planet from eons of us destroying it or doing bad things to it. This is literally a door that should not be opened, which is as close to classic horror as you could possibly get. It's just like, just don't open the door, but they're doing it anyway.
Yeah, and it's interesting how that's expressed sonically here, like through the sound that it's making, which is a very Doctor Who thing. In some ways, I think like the sound of the TARDIS, especially like in the first episode of An Unearthly Child when we first hear it, is itself like a kind of sonic horror of the world being like ripped apart and this horrible cosmic thing happening. It's interesting to see that, which isn't always present in Doctor Who. Like obviously that sound becomes more, it's described as a comfort in Day of the Doctor some 50 years after that episode.
Right.
But here we have Doctor Who really leaning into that notion of like the sound of horror.
Yeah, and the episode itself is very sparse in terms of music. Like, there's hardly any, I don't think. And it's down to the fact that you need that kind of omnipresent hum of the drill. That's the underscore. It unnerves you. Like, that much noise just constantly. There's a reason I mentioned David Lynch earlier, because, like, David Lynch knows how to do that and just, like, constantly get under your skin with industrial hums and things like that. And yeah, you're right. Like this one, it's part of the soundscape to a point where you kind of forget about it for a little while. It's just there all the time. But then they are able to ratchet it up when they need to, when they're getting too close, when the drill is starting to break down, and don't have to show anything. That's a really old-timey trick. There's a filmmaking adage where like anything can look kind of bad, but if it sounds bad, that's when people don't believe it. It has to sound good and correct and, full. And so you can get away with a lot by using great sound. And like the TARDIS and like the original theme song and everything like that, they were experimenting with different types of electronic sound to get stuff that people hadn't heard, which is kind of scary. It's like, oh, what is that? You've heard a lion roar or whatever, but you've never really heard this kind of squealing, the sound of the earth if the earth were alive and stuff like that is really kind of an unsettling idea. And it's probably just like, running a key across a piano string or something like that.
Yeah. I'm always fascinated by the sound design of Doctor Who, because as someone who's not really production minded on my end, once it's explained to me how much effort has been gone into it, the unusual sources they've had to look to for sound, I mean, it's like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. But it's a really indelible part of Doctor Who. Doctor Who wouldn't be right without the sounds of Doctor Who. Like Daleks that don't sound quite right are much worse than Daleks that don't look right.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's sort of a thankless task in a lot of ways sound designers have. If they do a good job, nobody notices them. And if they do a bad job, that's all anybody notices. They never get the praise, but they always get the ire of people if it's bad. And like I made some not very good short films when I was in college. And that was the thing that like, if you don't get the sound exactly right, and when the camera cuts, you hear a little like click noise because the sound is just slightly different from a different part of the room or something like that. It's so noticeable. Like even if the lighting isn't right in the two shots, it's the sound of the two shots that stands out to you. And so you should get a good sound person. Like if you're an independent filmmaker out there or a student filmmaker and you have a choice between a cinematographer or a sound designer, get a sound person. You can mess with a lot of stuff visually now because of computers and After Effects and things like that. But sound is like, you can't mess with sound. It has to be the base of what you're watching.
So in this moment, what do you think it tells us about the Third Doctor, that this is his approach to trying to reach out to these people?
He's a really interesting Doctor of whom I am a huge fan. But he's the first of the three that we'd had up to this point.
Goodbye, Liz.
Who is just like,
I shall miss you, my dear.
you guys are stupid
I've
and
had about all I can stand of this pompous, self-opinionated idiot here.
I don't have time for you, basically. That's his sort of approach to people who are closed-minded. He doesn't try really after a certain point. And through the entire episode, he just has been badgered with questions and like...
When did you first become a traitor?
How did you get into the complex?
The implication is he's being tortured.
You're wasting your time, you know.
But we don't see it, obviously.
I can stand a great deal of this childishness.
And he just goes, there's no point in talking to you because you're not listening to me. So he could be as reasonable as anybody could be, because he had been reasonable up to this point, and they still wouldn't listen to him because they have this preconceived notion of who he is and what he must be there doing. Like, You're here, ergo you must be a spy, because otherwise how could you be here? So he gets to that point and he has no other recourse. That's the thing that I love about it from a character perspective. All he can do is just say, listen to that. That is the sound of this planet screaming out its rage, which is so grandiose and like unsettling on a lot of ways. But that to me is what the Third Doctor is at his heart. He kind of weirdly brings the poetry to the horrors that are going on, because he's very pompous a lot of the time. And of any of them, he seems like the most aristocratic, or at least he's down with that kind of stuff. You know, we see later on in his run where he like is a big fan of wine and cheese and stuff like that.
Yes, that's a most good-humoured wine. A touch sardonic, perhaps, but not cynical.
Most doctors don't enjoy a drink.
Oh, why, it's horrid. I thought it would taste more like the gums.
But he kind of like talks down to them too a little bit, like, you fools, how dare you not listen to me kind of thing. But at that moment, he is desperate. And when the Third Doctor gets desperate, that's when you know it's bad, because he's so cool almost all of the time. Like, he's running away and he can't get away. And so he screams about the planet screaming out its rage. And it's just like, he has no other recourse. Like, all he can do is try to run away. And then eventually, like, after the cliffhanger into the next episode, he starts to calm back down. They take him away. But it's that moment that actually tells alternate universe Liz, oh, this, and like Greg Sutton, who's one of the side characters.
Doctor doesn't seem to think so.
Who cares what he thinks?
I do. He talks a lot of good sense.
He kind of believes the entire time. He's like our good guy throughout. And Petra is the same way, where she sort of understands that there's a problem, but like in this universe, she is beholden even more so to Dr. Stallman. But it's Liz kind of understanding, oh, this is a real threat and a real problem. And it's his assertion. Like, it's such a different kind of out of character moment for him up to that point. That's what kind of gives her the pause to go, oh yeah, this might actually be a real thing.
Yeah, it's so interesting because at the beginning of this story, when we first see the Doctor, he's kind of already at the end of his rope.
Right.
With our versions of these people. And things get progressively worse and worse in our universe. And then he gets shunted off into this universe where things are even worse because everyone's, a fascist. And so it starts where another story might end up.
All those so-called experts, it's a waste of valuable time and money.
He's already at loggerheads with Stallman.
Give that more lateral compensation, old chap, or you'll blow the main condenser.
The head of the project. And
cost thousands to put that right. Waste of valuable time and money.
It just gets worse and worse from there.
I'm rapidly losing patience with that man.
Yeah, and it's one of the genius things about the script. I mean, like if you've heard Terrence Dicks, R.I.P., ever talk about this story, it's that Don Houghton, the writer, came with a premise that wasn't going to last for 7 episodes. And the idea that I believe was Terrence's idea, what if he goes sideways in time, which is what they keep saying, instead of forwards or backwards? And so, yeah, you're right. He's at his wit's end, and then he goes to a place that is much worse and worse off. It's slightly ahead in the time. They've drilled farther down. One of my favorite things about the story, too, is there's the character Sir Keith Gold, who is played by Christopher Benjamin, who, of course, would go on to play Jago later on. But in the fascist universe,
Sir Keith Gold was killed in a motor accident 24 hours ago.
He's already been murdered.
Rather unfortunate.
By Stallman and the troops. And so
he was on his way to the ministry in London.
It's to complain about you, no doubt.
Every time thereafter we cut back to our universe, we kind of are going like, where is Sir Keith in relation to that plot? And then there's a certain point where like he's sent away and it's like, oh no, he's going to die, because that's what happens. There are things that are different, obviously, but then there are moments, kind of beats that are the same. And then obviously he doesn't die, spoilers.
Sir Keith.
My dear fellow, so you've come back to us after.
And that's our glimmer of
You're
hope.
not dead.
The fact that he doesn't die.
No, I came very close to it, though.
Why? What happened?
Car crash.
But you're not dead.
Exactly.
That's when the doctor knows that, all right, there's another way this might play out.
So not everything runs parallel.
And it's actually other than just like getting a few extra episodes out of it, because it's like, I think he goes halfway through episode 3 and then he comes back halfway through episode 6, I believe. And so you get a lot more of the regular universe than I remember. Every time I watch it, I think he's in the fascist universe for longer, but he's not. But it's the doctor seeing, oh, there is a brigadier who is just awful. Like what I have accused him of being, this man actually is. And then he's always had the camaraderie and the kinship with Liz Shaw. And then to see here that she's, section leader and she basically brushes off the idea of science for a moment.
Did you ever think of becoming a scientist?
And he kind of goes, but you wanted to be a scientist at one point or whatever.
Yes, I can see that you did.
It's where he sees like, things could be much worse in my universe and I just need to try to get back. And the big genius moment is he fails in the fascist universe. That world does die. And the only hope there is he goes back to try to save the universe that he knows and everybody else knows. A part of me always thinks, is it because that universe or that Earth doesn't have a doctor? Because as far as we know, there is no other doctor on that planet. They seem to have never heard of him. They never really examined that. Maybe in this universe, he never left Gallifrey or any number of things, which means that Earth is way worse off. And so like he's the different thing, and then he does his best, fails, and then he goes back. So we know the stakes. This is what will happen if and possibly when he fails again. And that's like really drives the tension of the entire story, is just seeing what happens when the doctor just straight up fails, because we haven't really ever seen that before.
How do you think this story would play if this digression into the other universe were removed and it were just a 4-part story about this drilling situation, which would remove this moment, of course?
I think about that a lot. The thing about it, and I think the reason it's a classic, is if they didn't go to the Sideways universe, if it was just a 4-parter, it's like a low-grade mad scientist story. And even with the Prime Words, it's still just kind of like, oh, there's monsters under here or whatever. There might be a little bit of creepiness to it, but the fact that he goes over there, it's terrible, whether it's fascist or not. I think the point of it all is that it's worse and he fails. And you need that. Like, it makes the tension as great as it is when he comes back. And yeah, I think it would just kind of be a boring story without it. Like, by making it so close and yet so completely different, like it's the mirror universe. Stallman even has a goatee in the other universe.
Parallel universe, coexisting with ours on another dimensional plane. Another Enterprise? Spock with a beard?
Or maybe he has it in the regular universe, doesn't he? Everybody loses their facial hair in the fascist universe. Yeah. But anyway, in general, I really dislike mirror universe stories. Like, this might be controversial, but I don't like Turn Left very much because I think it's well done. I'm not going to say it's not a well done story, but like,
can't remember.
There's no consequence at the end.
Slipping away.
Donna forgets all about it. Do you know what I mean?
Like when you try and think of a dream and it just sort of goes.
And the doctor's not in it. That's the point of that episode. But to me, the doctor learning that he can fail. Here's what happens when I fail. These people I know, and even though these are bad versions of people I know, there are brave people among them, and they all died. And that's what's going to happen if I don't do it. If we never saw what happened, we would lose so much of the heroism of the doctor in that moment. We don't really ever see the doctor that much under the gun and how much better off he kind of has it. It is sort of like a weird It's a Wonderful Life scenario.
Yeah.
It's Potterville when he goes to the fascist universe.
Pottersville? Why, you mean Bedford Falls?
I mean Pottersville. Don't think I know where I live?
Because everyone is just terrible. And he goes back and basically does the Doctor Who version of
Merry Christmas, you wonderful old building and loan!
To the Brigadier.
You really do look better with that moustache.
Who is the building and loan, let's be fair.
Of course.
But yeah, I think it would just kind of be boring or just kind of ho-hum. Seeing characters we know in a different light or in an evil light sort of thing, that's why this is as good as it is. That's why we remember it.
Do you think it changes how we think of the quote-unquote real-world characters based on what we see of their counterparts in the other universe?
I think it does. I love the Brigadier. He's never better than he is in season 7, in my opinion. I think the Doctor is a bit harsh on him throughout most of that season. And I mean, definitely leading up to that when he goes into the Sideways universe, because, the Brigadier is, he's a company man. He's a military man, but he is overall relatively reasonable. And then seeing a cowardly, sniveling, barbaric sort of version of the Brigadier in the Brigade Leader.
Hysteria won't help us, Brigade Leader.
Nothing will help us. That bore's going to blast any minute, and we'll all be roasted alive.
When we go back, we go, I guess he's not so bad. And the Doctor even says that a little bit. He's just like...
Pompous, self-opinionated idiot, I believe you said, Doctor.
Oh, I say, let's let bygones be bygones, old chum, or whatever he says at the end. And
Yes, well, we don't want to bear a grudge for a few hasty words, do we? No, not after all the years that we've worked together. Come along, my dear fella.
I think that kind of like gives him a little bit of purchase going forward in terms of, I guess the Brigadier isn't as buffoonish as I thought he was and everything like that.
Yeah, it's so interesting to look at it from the perspective of, I sometimes wonder what I would be like if I had grown up in a fascist regime. And the answer this story gives, I think, is a pretty interesting and nuanced one, in that if we were all living in a fascist regime, some of us would just be fascists because that's what we were raised in. And some of us would embrace that with gusto like the Brigadier. Some of us would have these little pockets of doubt like Liz. Some of us would be more like Greg, where he's basically just the same guy in that universe and he is consequently really on the outs with the regime and is just barely staying ahead of execution.
Yeah.
And then some of us like Stallman are already terrible in this universe and so would just transfer cleanly over there.
The last time I watched this properly for another podcast, I hit onto something which I thought was really interesting, which is that some of the characters are financially or like status-wise better off than they are in the proper universe. In our universe, Liz is the doctor's assistant. She is a doctor, but nobody ever calls her Dr. Shaw. They always call her Miss Shaw, which drives me insane.
Yeah. I'll send for a doctor.
I happen to be a doctor, Brigadier, remember?
And then in the fascist universe, Liz is, section leader and she's very well respected and everything like that. And then like you have Petra, who is Stallman's assistant in our universe. And then in that one, she is Dr. Petra Williams. It reminds you that in fascist societies, they do kind of give women higher status in a lot of places, but not good. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, we want everybody to be a fascist. So if you're a fascist, good for you, that kind of thing. It's an interesting sort of look at fascism in terms of the misogyny of capitalist society, I suppose, especially of the time where it's like women were not given all that much respect.
No.
And they still are not. But in the fascist universe, they are, but kind of aren't at the same time. It was more just like, well, what would be different about this universe kind of thing? And like you said, Greg's basically the same. But everybody else is sort of like raised. The Brigadier is not just a Brigadier. He's the brigade leader. He is the leader of this entire security faction and stuff like that. It kind of speaks to if you give people promotions, I guess, they're much more likely to actually just go along with it because they're in power. Why would you question all these things if you have status? Which I find really fascinating because that seems antithetical to, proper Western values and stuff like that. But it's also like everybody seems a little bit more like not happy. I would certainly not say happy, but, respected, I suppose.
To back up a bit, how did you first become a Doctor Who fan?
I started watching Doctor Who in earnest. Like I'd seen the odd episode here and there when my parents would watch it on PBS, and I knew what it was. And then I went to Comic-Con in 2009, and they were doing a screening of Planet of the Dead. David Tennant came out and said hello to everybody, and everybody kind of cheered. And it wasn't a huge room, but everybody in there was really like huge fans, like rabid fans of the thing. And they were hooping and hollering. And I kind of like in the back of my mind thought like, oh, wow, these people really like this show. And I've never watched it. My friend and I left, and we didn't watch the episode of Doctor Who.
Well, I mean, didn't miss much.
Exactly. I would later find out. But a couple months later on BBC America, one afternoon, I was home from work on my lunch break, and they were just starting Father's Day. And I was like, all right, hey, I'm home. I got nothing to do for an hour. Let me watch this. And I didn't know any of the characters. Like, I just kind of figured out what was going on through context clues.
Rose, there's a man alive in the world who wasn't alive before. An ordinary man. That's the most important thing in creation. The whole world's different because he's alive.
And I was so blown away by that episode that I was like, you know what? Maybe I'll give this a try. And I was like, Eccleston's a tremendous actor. And I know he only does this one season. I'll just do this one season. I'll just watch this one season. And I think if I'd have started with Rose, I probably wouldn't have kept watching because that episode is not my taste at all in terms of, tone. But because I'd seen Father's Day, I was like, well, I'll keep going. I'll give it a watch. And so I watched that entire season. And when I wrapped up that season, I went, that was really good. Well, I'm done. Well, I guess I could just see what this Tennant guy's like. And so then I watched the first episode. I was like, well, I guess I could just see what the main episodes are like. And I kept doing that until basically I had caught up, and I was caught up to live essentially by time it was the end of Time Part 1.
Oh, nice.
So, and then throughout that, I was sort of like, because I'm a completist at heart, if I get into something, I kind of want to know all about it. At that point, they were putting the DVDs out kind of piecemeal from the classic series. And so I would kind of like rent ones from Netflix when you got discs from Netflix. I don't remember those old days, everyone. But yeah, and I'd seen things here or there. But I remember like Inferno being one of the early DVDs I actually bought. It was like the 5 Doctor Special Edition, The Invasion with the animation, and then Inferno. Those were the first 3 classic DVDs I actually like owned. And so it's basically remained my favorite story ever since.
A pretty good starting point for the Third Doctor.
It definitely is. And I also feel like, because I was watching them as they were coming out, or more or less as they were coming out, and they didn't put out a ton of season 8 stories until relatively later on. And it's like, those are not good ones to end with because they're not very good, in my opinion. In my humble opinion, season 8 is not particularly good. But like, yeah, if you start with Inferno, there's nowhere else to go but down, really.
Right. More or less, yeah.
But I mean, hey, I love me some Third Doctor, but when he's got bad stories, they're pretty bad.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
Are you saying that Kronos is one of these creatures?
I am. The most fearsome of the lot.
How do you think that this story plays in 2022 differently from when you first encountered it in the late aughts?
Well, I never thought that I would have to be thinking so much about what a fascist society would be like.
Yeah.
It's definitely every time I've watched it over the last certainly 5-6 years, more and more I'm like, oh gosh, like this is, and understand like our non-fascist society is so tenuously, we're hanging on to it really just by the barest of threads at a certain point. And so every time I watch it, I kind of go like, yeah, and sort of like what you said, if I grew up in it, I probably would think nothing of it. But there are definitely people who didn't grow up in it who think that it's a better way to do it.
True.
That's the way the world ought to be and everything like that. Now I want to be in charge kind of stuff. So it definitely makes me feel like, oh gosh. And then there's the environmentalist angle, which they don't play up as much as they do in like the Green Death or something like that, where it's like very...
It's time that the world awoke to the alarm bell of pollution instead of sliding down the slippery slopes of...
on the nose about the environment, but like...
whatever it is.
We have to take care of the Earth because the Earth will kill us if we don't, and it'll be all our fault.
And it's starting to.
Right, exactly. Stuff like that really stands out nowadays, and how quickly things could go from bad to worse. It's interesting watching it now. It doesn't seem as science fictional as it once was. Some of the best like speculative fiction kind of sci-fi stuff is just like near future fascist society or dystopian futures and stuff like that. And I used to be like, oh gosh, why is that everywhere in the 70s? And it's like, it's because they were kind of on the cusp of it in the 70s. The 80s, we were basically in it, but everyone was happy about it. Or not everyone, but a lot of people were real happy about Thatcher and Reagan and stuff like that. And now it's like, oh, hey, we almost lost to that world again. It's a tough one. I don't know how left-leaning your listeners are, but that's where I come from. And you, let's be honest.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, throughout the past few years, really since the 2016 election, but certainly more and more throughout the pandemic, I keep turning to the notion of feeling like I'm living in an alternate reality dystopia.
Yeah.
And that somewhere out there, the right universe is humming along, everything's fine, we're all having our struggles, but we're all getting through, whereas we're living in like a discarded, we're darkest timeline, to borrow the Community term.
One thing has become clear. This is the darkest, most terrible timeline.
Enough with the timeline crap, Ahmed!
I go back and forth on that because obviously that episode of Community gave us all the term the darkest timeline that most people use on the internet. But there was a time during, the heyday of like 2017-18 when things were really bleak and people would say, this is the darkest timeline. I would bristle at that, being like, there is no darkest timeline. This is just the timeline. We can't hold on to the hope that we might travel to a different timeline. You know what I mean? Like,
no, you're right.
And so that's what sci-fi gives us, is the opportunity to see the worst case scenario and then hope for the best case scenario. But yeah, as a big sci-fi fan, it's hard not to go like, oh boy, is there the Star Trek Prime universe out there that is much better off and they don't have money and they barely fight and stuff like that? If I think about it too hard, I kind of get sad.
Yeah. And my whole like thinking of myself as being in an alternate timeline is a certain like wallowing in self-pity that's not healthy.
Yeah.
But it's tempting. It's just such a different perspective on stories like this. Turn Left also is one that activates that in me now.
Is the new law England for the English, etc. They build labor camps.
I know.
I don't know. It just seemed silly to me before, and it seems a lot less silly to me now. I think the 70s had a different perspective on this than I did in the aughts. I feel like we hadn't really quite shaken off the end of history illusion from like the 90s, that like we were living in the pinnacle of human civilization, and that like the 90s was the peak, as they say in The Matrix, it was like the peak of human civilization.
Yeah.
The late
Which
90s.
is why The Matrix was redesigned to this, the peak of your civilization.
That's not the world we live in. History is just like a whole bunch of contingent possibilities where it could go one way or it could go another way. And the story like really brings those thoughts to the forefront. You can totally see why people who lived a lot closer to World War II, for instance, would feel that way about fascism.
Yeah, and I just recently I didn't watch the entire run, but I kind of picked the 50, what people consider the 50 best episodes of The Twilight Zone, because I hadn't really watched that much of it. And there are quite a few fascist like society episodes, and there's a really good one called The Obsolete Man, starring Burgess Meredith as a former librarian, when there was no room for a librarian in this fascist society.
You are obsolete, Mr. Wordsworth. A lie. No man is obsolete.
This is the story, and obviously Rod Serling was sort of that way, where like it seems so far-fetched that the society would have gotten to this point where we just think that anybody who reads books and is intellectual is a fool and a moron and stuff like that. And that episode came out in like 61 or 2 or something like that. And then like you jump to the 70s where they make sci-fi movies like Soylent Green.
Next thing they'll be breeding us like cattle for food.
It's just an absolute nightmare.
Tell them. You gotta tell them.
Promise, Tiger. I promise.
Of overpopulation, and like the haves live in these giant tall buildings with opulence and robot slaves and stuff like that, and everybody else lives in like the corridors of buildings because there's just no room for people and stuff like that. The 60s really wore off the kind of idea that everything is good and we beat fascism. And because everybody thought it was good, people got complacent, and then they just ruined everything. And then by the time you get to so much of the 70s Doctor Who is they would just turn off the power. So a bunch of people couldn't watch the show because they were, having these planned blackouts and stuff like that. And there were minor strikes. There was so much unrest going on at the time. And that's the context we sort of lose being so far removed from that.
Yeah.
But it definitely feels a lot more when we watch 70s stuff now. I kind of get it. Like, I kind of understand the kind of anger behind it that I maybe didn't when I first watched it in the 2010s.
True, yeah. I probably understand that era a lot better because of Doctor Who. Oof. But to get back to the moment, so the Doctor, this is his desperate appeal to stop the drilling in the alternate universe. It doesn't work. He later gets a do-over. How do you think his approach is better or worse in his second attempt, where it's more just wail on it with a hammer?
Stop this drilling! Stop this drilling! You don't understand, do you?
I think at that point he's just like, I gotta try something, man. He does seem a little much more desperate. I think he even understands that even though Liz in his universe is sympathetic to him and the Brigadier is not horrible and everything like that, that Stallman is still the thing that stands in the way. And he sees what could come of it if they don't do it. So yeah, I kind of love the fact that he's just like, no finesse. I'm not going to try to explain what the matter is. I'm not going to try to mess with it with little rewiring it or whatever, but I'm just going to destroy it, which makes me laugh. But it also is like, that's the thing that works. Sometimes you just got to destroy a bad thing.
Indeed.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's what I hope everyone takes away from this.
Yeah. That was The Moment. Thanks again for listening, and thanks to Kyle Anderson for being my guest. Kyle is senior editor at Nerdist.com, where he also hosts the podcast Laser Focus, a delightfully deep dive on pop culture topics with his colleagues and guests. And he also co-hosts the long-running Writers' Room podcast with past guest of this show, Eric Stadnick, where the two of them talk in depth about Doctor Who and other shows via their writers. Mostly Doctor Who, though. And if you'd like to hear Kyle talk more about the Third Doctor in particular, he and past guest Joy Piedmont did a wonderful podcast called 5 Years Rapid, discussing the Jon Pertwee era story by story, which wrapped up in 2021, but which is still well worth a revisit. And you can also find Kyle himself on Instagram at functional_nerd. Thanks once again to all of you for journeying with me on this new season of The Moment, and for tuning into this, the October 2024 edition of The Moment, which, like all great October editions, is releasing November 4th. Hey, you know what? Tomorrow is November 5th, the election day in the United States, and if you are in the United States and are listening to this before the polls close, why not go do a bit of voting to see if we can avoid the fascist timeline over here? Hint, hint, don't vote for Donald J. Trump. Vote for the other one. And if you're listening to this after the polls close, well, then there's always next time, I hope. Head over to themomentpod.com/social to find links to where you can follow the show's Twitter-style microblogs on Mastodon or Blue Sky, or follow short-form video posts on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Honestly, those short-form video posts are really fun to make, and the one for the last episode got more views than the podcast episode itself had listens. So go ahead, catch the wave. Don't be the only one who's missing out on these great vids. You can also support the show, or just follow it on Patreon by going to patreon.com/themomentpod. That is all for now. I'm Tom Nickinson, and I'll be back in a moment.
0 minus 1 minute 40 seconds. Technical personnel at final stations. 0 minus 1 minute 30 seconds. Final power.